I should address the whole question about Daniel Kaufman. All right. I mean, you mentioned, the Doctrines of the Bible came out in 1927. Daniel Kaufman was the editor of that book. He wasn't, now he did write some of the chapters, but it was not all his work. He was the editor. And it actually had a predecessor in 1914. A book had come out called Bible Doctrines, and some of the chapters in Doctrines of the Bible originated as chapters in Bible Doctrines. Okay, now there was some revision and so on of that book. So, in some sense, the Bible Doctrines book um, um, is really where some of the language that is framed. But even before that, Daniel Kaufman himself did write a book called Manual of Bible Doctrine. Okay. And it's a much smaller book. And some of the theological categories that he is using at that particular point show up in the later works. One of the things that he talks about is he has this category called restrictions. Okay. And this primarily deals with nonconformity issues. And it's language that then is used later. Okay. And interesting enough, in 1921, when the General Conference of the Mennonite Church, not to be confused with the General Conference Mennonite Church, okay, but the General Conference of the Mennonite Church, which was the various conferences of the Mennonite Church sent delegates to this, representatives to this, and it started in I think around 1899. I might be wrong there by a year or two, but in 1921, they adopted at Garden City, Missouri, where the conference was being held that year, the Mennonite Fundamentals. And interesting enough, this was a document that actually originated in Virginia. And it was a document drawn up primarily by some, what I would describe as fundamentalist Mennonites, people like J.B. Smith and A.D. Wanger and George R. Brunk I. And these all, by the way, were premillennialists. So they're suspect from the very beginning. But that's a whole different podcast. But they do really, and of course, the other thing to keep in mind is that this is in the midst of the whole modernist fundamentalist controversy in Protestantism, among Protestant churches in North America to start with. And it is also in the context, and I think Nathan Yoder's dissertation, whose title I can't pull off right now, but his dissertation does a really good job. It's a shame it wasn't ever published, but it does a really good job of describing this period of time. And one of the things that the older scholarship, in 1923, Goshen College was closed down, and Daniel Kaufman played a major role in closing that down. It was closed down for a period of time because of theological liberalism. Now, some people have argued that really the question was not theological liberalism; it actually revolved around nonconformity issues. But as Nathan and nonconformity issues indeed were part of the issue. But I came across a number of years ago at the Mennonite Historical Association, the Cumberland Valley's archives, a small collection of a bishop in our area by the name of George Keener, who was a bishop from 1899 or something like that to the 1930s. And in it was this mailing, and I think it was something that was sent out to Mennonite ministers across the country. It had these postcards in. And this is like in the early 20s, okay, for Goshen. And it showed a photograph of a theater production put on at Goshen College, and shows the student actors there dressed up in their theatrical costumes. And I would just say any Mennonite minister, I should say most Mennonite ministers in North America, if they saw that in 1920s, they would have been troubled. Okay, they would have been troubled. I was troubled when I saw it. I said, well, this really does show what was going on here. These folks had something to be concerned about. But as Nate Yoder shows, as Nate Yoder's shows, there was also theological. I mean, the earlier scholarship said no, there was no theological this liberalism song, but as Nate Yoder has shown, there actually was theological liberalism there in some of the faculty who were using modernist text in Bible classes and stuff like that. And so, one of the most interesting persons, again, he's somebody who really deserves a biography, is John Horsch, this immigrant who came over in the 1880s from Bavaria and got involved with John F. Funk's publishing and so on, and also is probably the founder of Mennonite history studies here in North America. Wrote much about early Anabaptism and so on. He becomes really much taken up with this whole modernist fundamentalist controversy and writes books and pamphlets about it and so on. But anyhow, what happens is that some of these people now, I should mention that John Horsch was not a premillennialist. Okay, so you wouldn't have to be a premillennialist to be concerned about some of this stuff. Okay. But what happens then is that these folks are reading essentially fundamentalist literature. And some of them have gone to Moody Bible Institute and other fundamentalist colleges or Bible schools and so on. And so they're carrying with them some of this language. Okay, some of this language. And then that is reflected in the 1921 Confession of Faith, which is adopted there at Garden City at the General Conference meeting, and so on. Now, interestingly enough, I would say that actually, when it comes to Daniel Kaufman, he, in a sense, is kind of the John F. Funk of his day. He's cautious. He is a genuinely conservative-minded person concerned about traditional definitions of nonconformity and stuff like that. But there does seem to be in his writings the beginnings of a kind of a divide between their theology of salvation, how one becomes a Christian, how one is quote unquote saved, and the way they live, the way the person is supposed to live. Okay. And I would say also there were other persons for whom that divide became even wider and wider and wider. And I would say that each successive generation after that, the gap became wider and wider and wider and wider until you have the situation you have today and the assimilated Mennonite groups. I haven't said everything I would like to say about Daniel Kaufman because that would be a podcast in itself. I like Daniel Kaufman. I really do. I like him. He was a mediating force. He was a man who was always seeking, in a sense, the various groupings and ideas and so on, getting them together to work things out for the good of the church. He was a very conservative-minded person in many ways, a very strong advocate of non-resistant, non-conformity, and so on. And through his editorship of the Gospel Herald for almost 30 years, I would say 30 years, he had a major impact on the church. He was a giant. And we don't have giants anymore like Daniel Kaufman. Maybe we shouldn't have had one back then. I don't know. But he certainly was a giant.